This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, Happy New Year and welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras. I'm here with James Majewski. Hey James.
Hello, Happy New Year, everyone.
And we are back with another installment of our series on the Vatican film list. We're discussing the series Dekalog, directed by Krzysztof Kieslowski, a series of 10 short films inspired by the 10 Commandments. And we'll be discussing number 5 today, dealing with the 5th commandment.
We're halfway through.
Yeah, we're halfway through. We've been doing one episode per episode in this series, and as you can, it's been taking quite a while because we were only doing them every 6 weeks. So we're glad to be halfway through. And we do have a guest today. I encountered this person's work when looking for, I guess I must have been looking for articles about Kieslowski on the internet, and I found a series of essays she had written on Kieslowski and on a number of different Catholic or sort of semi-Catholic directors such as John Ford and Frank Borzage on Crisis magazine, back when Crisis was not nonstop culture wars 24/7 and had a lot of arts and culture type things as well. She is a lecturer in film studies at California State University Northridge. Her name is Maria Elena de las Carreras Kuntz. Welcome, Maria Elena.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here.
We're really happy to have you on here. And when I got in touch with you, you said that you specifically wanted to discuss number 5 because you've been showing it to your students for a long time. But you also told me that you rewatched the entire Decalogue series in preparation for the first time in 20 years, you said, in preparation for this discussion. So can you just tell us a little about your impression of the series as a whole and how that repeated viewing of it informed your perspective?
I first encountered the whole Decalogue attending the San Sebastián Film Festival in Spain in 1988, in the fall of 88. And then the Decalogue came to Los Angeles. It was later released on VHS tapes and shown at the Sundance Channel. And then there was an early 21st century release DVD. And now there's a fairly recent one, 2016, on Blu-ray. But it's not a piece of filmmaking that has been familiar to film professors and film critics, but the availability wasn't such. So I took advantage the moment it came out on DVD and with some other films of Kieslowski to show it to the class with this idea that there has to be a conversation between faith, culture, the arts, beauty, and the use of cinema as a tool for exploring the issues of the human condition. So when I was very nicely invited by Crisis Magazine, thanks to Dr. Ralph McInerney, who was one of the founders of Crisis and who had been to Buenos Aires, Argentina, my home country, in 1985, and thanks to whom I was able to apply and be selected for a Fulbright fellowship, I always thought that I had a debt to pay to Professor McInerney for this opportunity. So I had been thinking, and I'm not the only one, that because film is a very material way of looking at reality, you have a physical copy of, so to speak, and you have the possibility from that reality to go into the transcendent, into the mystery, into other things. I began to see how it is that you could work with the human experience as seen through cinema. So I was primarily interested at the time in Hollywood filmmakers, Frank Capra, John Ford, who had been brought up in Catholic households, and a wonderful filmmaker, Frank Borzage, Italian Swiss, who had come via living in Mormon land until he was 20. I came to see how there is a mindset that you bring with you. I have a Southern European Mediterranean mindset. I may be from Argentina, but have a background that allows me to see a number of things in a way that my Anglo-Saxon Jewish husband doesn't, right? So we have the individuality versus the community. We have the cult of the self-made man. We have all the advantages and disadvantages of the mindsets. And I started to see that in Hollywood filmmakers. But I had been very aware that there were European filmmakers, classic and more modern at the time, say Robert Bresson in France, or Federico Fellini in Italy, that also had, with various elements, a way of looking at things that showed a mindset that was Catholic. The place and the situation, of course, with Poland is important because when I was probably your age or maybe younger, I was super aware of what was happening in what we now would then call Eastern Europe, and now had gone back to be Central Europe. Very aware. And I had a sort of a chance encounter with Christoph Zanussi in Buenos Aires. He had come in the late 1980s to talk about Polish cinema and to teach at one of our film schools. So the phenomenon of the Polish cinema, like all of the cinema behind the Iron Curtain, which was a cinema of subversion and rebellion, indirectly and metaphorically, I was in tune with that approach, right? I hadn't seen Chinese cinema at the time enough to see what was the case with some Chinese filmmakers, like Zhang Yimou, for example, or Chen Kaiji at the beginning of the careers that were against all these totalitarian regimes. So when I got to see the Decalogue in its entirety, I was blown away. So I was blown away in 1988, again in the year 2000, and 20 years later when you kindly invited me to give my impressions. So my impressions are the same. It is the Catholic imagination at work. The paradox is that film, like so many other artistic creations, is a Rorschach test. So in many ways, you are predisposed to see a certain number of things. And it can be argued that because I look at things from a Catholic lens, I am really seeing things that may not be there. However, I rewatched the whole thing. I even watched Kieslowski, Piesewicz, his screenwriter collaborator in 7 films, directed by Tom Tykwer in the early 21st century, called Heaven. And it may have the flourishes of Tykwer, Run Lola Run, a number of things, but boy, it is completely Kieslowski Piesewicz, all the way down to the final shot where literally the 2 characters ascend to heaven in a helicopter. And you get to see this conversation between the material world and something that goes beyond it. And you see that physicality and metaphysicality in that last shot of a film written but not directed by Kieslowski. So the experience of these past days has been to, what can I tell you, reinforce all these beautiful emotions that I have, all the way down to the possibility of cinema, certainly in this day and age, to engage in dialogue. I'm waiting for an American filmmaker that can make sense and transcend the current polarization. We haven't seen those films yet, right? We have seen the polarized situation with one side, many ways, prevailing. So Kieslowski is, it's not for binging, because it requires, as you well described in your Decalogue 4, it's an uncertain territory and a territory of great sympathy, but also of disturbing consequences. And I had the same shock when I saw again Decalogue 4 about respect, honoring father and mother. And I thought, how are these young men going to talk about a horrific crossing of boundaries? And you discuss the matter beautifully, because ultimately, even that conversation about boundaries that you had about repression or suppression is a useful one in daily life, because sometimes we're better off not knowing something, right? It's a delicate Talmudic approach to life. I don't have to know everything. I don't have to be Adam and Eve tempted by you'll be like God if you eat from this tree. So the Decalogue is all the 10 episodes are showing you the challenges. Some end well, some not so well, but these are challenges that we all face, right?
Well, thank you for your kind words about our previous discussion. What you just said about not having to know everything, I have to say this because whenever there's a callback to a previous discussion, I have to mention it, is exactly what was said by one of our former guests, Anthony Esselin. We had Anthony Esselin on to discuss John Ford's film Stagecoach, and I don't remember the context of why he said this, but at one point he was simply talking about discretion. I believe it was some character in the film exercising a certain discretion about, it might have been the scene where they're all at the table and the woman who's a prostitute, John Wayne's character, exercises a certain discretion about her occupation, even mentioning it, or something like that. And
that he's not dumb, but he doesn't need to know.
Yeah, and Anthony Esselin basically said, this is something that's really lacking in our time. Everything has to be said, even among Catholics. Everything has to be named. Everything has to be said, and sometimes it's simply not necessary. Sometimes it's more charitable, to simply, pass over a matter in silence.
When the article I published on Kieslowski came out in Crisis Magazine in November 2000, I thought, what do I have to lose by sending a copy of the magazine to John Paul II? So I prepared an envelope, wrote it, John Paul II, care of Cardinal Disiewicz, the Vatican, Italy, and lo and behold, 3 weeks later, or maybe less, I get a little tiny envelope, completely unprepossessing, and it was this letter from Cardinal Disiewicz that literally says, your letter of November 3, 2000 with the enclosed November issue of Crisis Magazine are appreciated. The article filming the Ten Commandments, Kieslowski as Catholic director, which speaks about the great accomplishment of the famous Krzysztof Kieslowski, was read with much interest. And then has a final paragraph on the role of a Catholic journalist. I was stunned.
Wow, that's cool.
And it has been
that
a
really
highlight. Unbelievable. Because it has
That's quite remarkable.
I know. And you should see the Unpreprocessing envelope. And I thought, oh boy, does that say something? And the other thing is I'm the Catholic side of Catholic Jewish marriage. And when I saw in 1988, we got married in 91, but I already had met my future husband, Jonathan Kuntz. I was stunned by Dekalog 8 because it is dealing with the issue of Catholic Jewish relations in Poland. And I noticed right away that the protagonist had, not the philosophy professor, but the woman that comes who's Jewish, raised by Catholic, she had a chain with a cross and a Jewish symbol. I misunderstood and I thought I had seen a Star of David, but it wasn't. But I got the Star of David anyway. And I now realized that it was a chai, or Haim, the sign for life, right? So I have to correct this, but I have had this since the year 2000 when I saw, actually 98, 88, when I saw the Kieslowski Decalogue. I thought, well, this is a great introduction to a Jewish Catholic marriage. So I'm particularly fond of Kieslowski, as you can imagine.
Before we get into the details of this film, we've been trying to do a better job of giving a synopsis beforehand.
That's right.
So I think we should go ahead and do that.
That's right. Yeah, because a lot of times we're just so excited to talk about the movies, we just dive right in.
Right.
But many of our viewers won't have watched the film actually by the time they're listening to this.
So this is the very, very simple movie in its story. It follows three characters. It follows this young man who's about 20 years old, just kind of wandering around the city. It follows a lawyer who's passing the bar at the exam at the beginning of the film, and it follows this taxi driver who I mentioned. And the young man ends up murdering the taxi driver, and then the young lawyer now has to take his case and to accompany him to his execution. So, what made you choose Decalogue number 5 and its feature film adaptation, a short film about killing, to speak to your students about out of all of these episodes?
It's a conscientious decision, primarily because it's about the value of life, even the life of the, in quote, despicable, right? And so I always run into trouble. 3 semesters ago, I landed in the Office of Equity and Diversity because I hadn't given, according to an anonymous denunciation, a warning, enough warning to let them know that we would see a brutal killing, right? And besides, I had said, I had the, seemingly simple question, what other type of people in this American society today are considered without worth? And of course, I was hoping that they would tell me the unborn. And I have to rephrase my question in subsequent semesters because someone raised a hand and said LBGTQ. And I said, well, it's not the same.
Yeah.
It's not the same, right? So this is, to go to your question, the level of the confusion and the casualness with which issues of life and death are happening. Last November, I had to fly to Argentina on an emergency for what ended up being, and I knew this, the death of my father. And I was able to see the beauty, and it was a gift, of a natural death surrounded by love at home, children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, the value we put to a death that was part of the family fabric, not alone. It was a blessing. So all these issues of life, of the value of life, I'm enormously attuned to in all the classes I teach. So this gave me the opportunity of bringing up a topic that is here of importance. I don't know if you guys have read, and I will certainly assign this article. We're beginning the semester in a couple of weeks to my class on December 17. A columnist of the New York Times, I think it's Elizabeth Brunig, wrote a long piece about attending a death penalty execution. And she writes from a Catholic perspective, and she's vocal about it. And you have to avert your eyes from reading the piece at some point because it's brutal. And she has the same thing of Kieslowski, a clinical eye and a detachment that creates a space for the conversation. What does death penalty serve to? And I have found, first off, that 1 hour long film in a classroom works fine, even though now they will have to watch it online. So I'm not so sure how the experience will be. They will fast forward in the two crimes, who knows? But it brings, like all of the Kieslowski work, the conversation about issues that matter on how one should live our life. So there's a moral reason, and there's also an aesthetic reason. How do you portray the horror, the taking of a human life twice in 60 minutes, right? And there's always an interesting connection with Hitchcock and Dekalog 5, and then Dekalog 6 in general too, which is about the act of viewing, the act of seeing something that happens. And in Hitchcock's The Torn Curtain, phenomenal, interesting Cold War era film, you get to see what you see in Kieslowski, how difficult it is to kill someone. There was a conversation of Kieslowski in one of these materials in the latest DVD version, where he tells that the film was shown in Venice, and at some point the audience could no longer take the second killing. And they may have seen other films in the festival that had a killing a second. And it's the realism with which he portrays the killings, right? Which is quite stunning in the Hitchcock film as well, right? So this vocation that Kieslowski had, because he was primarily a documentary filmmaker looking at things, he brings to the fiction cinema. And you discussed very well the other day his formation as a documentary filmmaker. At some point, he had to cross a barrier. And if you want to comment on shape characters, you have to exit the documentary, because you're not being faithful to your subjects, because you're showing a view of them, right?
Well, it's discretion again.
Exactly right. And so, and this happens in connection with Dekalog 5, because he had one of the characters in one of the documentaries, a real person that was in favor of capital punishment and the state executing, and so you can no longer explore all that through a documentary, right?
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that documentary. It's called From a Night Porter's Point of View. It's one of my favorites. I've watched a lot of his documentaries now on YouTube, and it's called From a Night Porter's Point of View. And when I was watching Dekalog 5, the character of the taxi driver, something about him actually reminded me of this guy, this night porter, who's kind of like a sadistic character in a way. I don't want to go too far into that, but it was just interesting that you brought that up, because I was thinking about that character again when I was watching this
exactly, because you see these ideas a filmmaker and Priesevics, the writer, have, and they are there. They come out. When you see Heaven, in many ways, you're also seeing Decalogue 6, the Tom Tykwer film Heaven. It's those characters, right? Kieslowski and Priesevics have this distinction that they made, which is so relevant, and I'm uncomfortable showing a film about overt sexual things in class, because it's a hassle. It's a hassle, and the modesty.
Sure.
What do you do with it? But Decalogue 6 brings, as you know, head on the question of love as eros or love as agape, and it's so clear, and it's the inversion of the terms that get done at the end, basically, of the film. So, right.
That's great. Yeah, we've got a nice sneak peek at our next Decalogue episode. Yeah.
Can I ask you? You mentioned to me on the phone a while back that you had been at an event where Krzysztof Piesowicz spoke. Is that right?
Yes. In the year 2000, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, 4 years after the death of Kieslowski, had an homage to him. And here's the one where I have I got to talk to him. I had him inscribe my program, and he has gone on writing films, and you can see the mindset of a lawyer that blended very well with that of Kieslowski. Kieslowski has said in books, interviews, etc., that it's not that Piesowicz knew how to write. It is that he saw the conflict, the moral conundrum that these characters have. And Decalogue 5 is based, he remarked on that, on his experience of the first 2 years of being a lawyer. He was a lawyer for Solidarity, so he got to see the mechanisms of how the state worked, which is exactly at the core of Decalogue and a short film about killing, the workings of the state. And this is it is interesting because at some point you may want to consider some other Polish filmmaker. She hasn't made the Vatican list, but she has been dealing with Catholic subjects since forever, which is Agnieszka Holland.
Yeah.
So
I've seen,
Holland
yeah.
is about the workings of organizations. So in The Third Miracle, for example, which is a film made in the US, she doesn't quite have, she has a view of the church as an institution, right? Which I bet is an approach, a Polish approach of so many years of dealing with institutions, the state institutions, and some may have felt that the functionings of the Catholic Church at some point warranted the study of certain dynamics. So Holland is more in the outs. Kieslowski and Piesewicz are not interested in the workings of institution. They are interested in seeing how people function in that day, age, and place.
You know, Dekalog 5 is unique in a number of respects in the Dekalog series. Well, along with Dekalog 6, as we mentioned, these are the two that were made into feature-length films. So I think maybe after we discuss the plot of the film more, we can probably ask why Kieslowski did this and what it adds. But by itself, it's unique in two respects. First of all, you mentioned their lack of interest in institutions. In the book Kieslowski on Kieslowski, he talks about his lack of interest in politics and in his films, especially with regard to Decalogue. He makes a point of how he avoided showing things like people waiting in ration lines and, you know, all of these little ugly, mundane institutional aspects of life in communist Poland. 5 is an exception to that, although you're right, of course, that it focuses on the people. But it is still more political in that it is dealing explicitly with the death penalty, and Kieslowski stated a very didactic aim. So I would say it's unique from all the other films in that respect as well, because most of them, we've had this experience watching these films repeatedly, except maybe with the first one, that like I watch it and I really don't know what the point of it was until we discuss it, and then that it kind of starts to emerge in the course of discussion. This one, it's fairly straightforward, I think, in its point and what it's about. The other aspect in which it's unique is its visual style. We talked on the show before about how Kieslowski used 9 different cinematographers for the 10 episodes because he wanted them to all look different, but they ended up all converging on a very similar style, with the exception of this one, because of the way that the cinematographer, whose name escapes me at the moment, used countless filters. I think it was about over 600 filters that he used on the camera to create this very ugly, dirty, very green tinted, muddy kind of look for this film, which in some ways is kind of, especially in the short film version, I would say is perhaps the most unrelentingly ugly and dismal of the films, as far as I remember. So I would like to maybe start talking about the visual style first. I mean, it's pretty obvious why the cinematographer wanted to do this, because of the subject matter of the film. He wanted to really put you in a very bleak landscape, and especially in the short film version, almost all of the human interactions you see are pretty negative. You know, you have the old woman who tells our young protagonist to get away because he's scaring the pigeons when in fact he's not. They're perfectly fine. You know, there's this kind of sense of unwelcomeness that's present in general. And so I think, aside from the subject matter being about killing, it's portraying a kind of cold and indifferent or even hostile social order, starting with the first shot of first of all a dead rat and a dead cat in the short film about killing, and then in Dekalog 5 somebody throwing a dirty rag from an apartment window at the taxi driver. So it very much goes along with the kind of social atmosphere of the film, as well as the topic of murder. But Maria Elena, do you have any more thoughts on the visual style of this film?
Well, first off, it's interesting to notice that there is a Polish school of cinematography, basically the seeds planted in the Łódź Film School, the film school not far where the Pope was born. And that film school generated, together with the famous Prague Film School, a series of cinematographers trained in documentary, in an adherence to realism, and also coming from a tradition of expressionism. So Slavomir Itzhak, the cinematographer, he was in film school at the same time of Kieslowski. They worked together for television, and he was put in charge of Number Five, a very distinctive style, as you note. That led to his being involved in Double Life of Veronique, and then Three Colors Blue, the last of the Three Colors trilogy. And then he began a career in Germany and in the US. So if you have seen Black Hawk Down, which is a terrific film, or Arthur, he brings that sort of a dark contrast of things in all his work. Here, what I always like to repeat to my students is, I'm taking this almost as a class, that a film carries or transmits the DNA of its time. So if on the surface, this is not a political film, you scratch a little bit and it's enormously political. There might not be the surface push to saying this is the horrific, dehumanizing system that we have, but all of the Decalogue is, or Blind Chance, or No End, or Camera Buff, all are records of misery. And what's so brutal in Dekalog 5, much more in a short film about killing, is the portrait of cruelty. It goes beyond hostility, beyond indifference, is the cruelty we inflict to one another, right? So I don't know exactly how he had the creative conversations with Itzhak, but you can see that the emphasis has been through those yellowy greenish colors, the color of envy, horrific, an emphasis on the cruelty, which is the stunning and completely on your face opening shots of a short film about killing, which is 25 minutes longer than the other film. And it's not just a dead cat, it's a cat that has been cruelly hung, probably by miscreants. So it's a little bit too much cross to your jaw, that beginning of a short film about killing, but it sets the parameters of the cruelty which will never let off. That's the situation. It is somewhat tempered by the fact that we have a frame of reference for that film and the shorter version, which is The Lawyer. There is a very distinctive decision to come up with a frame for the story, which is the lawyer taking the bar to be a practicing lawyer in Poland, and at the end, he has become a public defense lawyer, and he has had a trajectory. He's no longer the sort of wide-eyed young man thinking that the law is powerful to change and improve, as he says, nature. He has now seen the horror that you can use the law to destroy, right? And so another interesting thing is that the end of the longer version does not have a line or this character, Piotr Bilicki, screaming, "I abhor this." right? The longer film, it's doesn't have that line. I once had a Polish family student in my class that told me, and I forgot to write this down, that he's not really saying "I abhor." But maybe, Mr. Majewski, you are of Polish origin, and someone hearing the sentence can tell you. But he has gone a full body change, like it's typical of Kieslowski, the going from A to Z. And this is reflected by the really one and only instance of nature being sort of semi-pleasant, which is the dawn or the end of the day where we don't see the city. So the cinematography was used in visual style in general, in conjunction with the sound, to present us a theater of cruelty. Unlike the other films, it's an extreme. The editor, and this is also part of the documentaries that are attached to the Criterion release disc on after chapter 10, Decalogue 10, she says, because I had never really read anything about it, that the two films were shot one in parallel. So because I thought, well, we have an editor that will add to the shorter film extended moments that were left in the cutting room on purpose. But no, they shot, and there's a back-to-back in the documentary showing, side by side, showing of how the scenes were shot. And they are exactly, they're not repeated, right?
Yeah.
So...
Well, Ava Small, the editor, it was interesting what she said. I watched this a couple of months ago, and I noted what she said about these longer films. She said that they shot them separately, or not at the same time, but different footage, different shots. And then they used the better footage for the longer films. But then when they compared them to the shorter footage taken for the shorter films, they thought it was so much less good as to be unusable. So they ended up actually making a negative dupe of scenes for the longer films, and they ended up having some identical scenes for that reason. So they did end up taking scenes from the longer film and putting it in the shorter film instead of using the original short film takes. But I think there's still some differences, even in the scenes that are the same from a script perspective. For example, you mentioned the I abhor this, but also, I think even the way that the character scares away the pigeons might be different in the two different films. I noticed.
It's an interesting assignment for the students, because they get to see students in film school are always in love with what they write and with what they shoot. They can never get rid of anything, right? And in many ways, the shorter film is much better in many ways, except for the fact that we don't have the scene in the cafe where we see the lawyer, a point of providence or fate or whatever, they coincide in that cafe scene. But other than that, what is added is not relevant. What does a motorcycle ride through Warsaw add to the story? I don't think it adds any.
Well, it's interesting. James and I had a different impression of this when we watched the short version. We felt that it was a little bit heavy-handed in its didacticism, where the lawyer's bar exam was almost practically used as a voiceover, because we didn't see the people on the other side of the table, so to speak. We didn't see the people who were examining him. We didn't see them smiling when he used his quote. His classical quote about punishment not changing, the behavior of mankind. I felt that the longer version of the film breathed a little bit, but you're right. I think some of it is unnecessary to the plot. One thing I did like that the longer version had was the scene with the painter. Basically, in the short version, we only see him asking for directions, and it's kind of almost an indifferent interaction like every other one. In this longer scene, we get to see a little bit of a positive interaction with another person, and even possibly an area of hope for this character who ends up committing the murder, where he's talking to the painter, and the painter says, "Do you have a talent?" And he's like, "No." And the painter says, "Can you?" I forget what he says. "Can you make shoes?" or something like that. And he says, "No." And he says, "What about plant a tree?" And he says, "Yeah, I could do that." He's like, "Oh, good. So there's nothing to worry about," you know? And so that is a little bit of a contrast. We don't get a lot of cheerful scenes like that in the film, except another one being the little girls outside the cafe window when he plays the prank on
they
them,
have some
all
trepidation.
laugh.
They are also startled.
Right.
But the reason why I would say I don't favor that extended version is because nothing in that film, in the shorter version, prepares you for the change of heart you, the viewer, have with what can be called the confession scene, when we get to see, very skillfully shot, when the day of the execution, the lawyer goes to visit him. At first, we see him and Jacek behind bars. We are completely behind bars. We're not part of that. But the moment the explanation comes, or who he is, the interiority, the camera is already with you and them, and the bars can no longer be seen. So it is a very skillful, powerful way of taking you into the milk of human kindness, so to speak. Because what I tell the students at the beginning is, watch out and see if at some point you establish a current of sympathy with this character who's despicable. And it never fails to happen. Having something foreshadowing, I don't know, but it is so powerful at that moment that you end up getting inside of a soul, right? Piesevich is the one that has said that, I had the line here because I never quote right, man is soul clothed in a body. So it is at that moment of the confession that you get to see the soul of Jacek Lazar, as in Lazarus, right? So there's the possibility of the mysterious, unfathomable of a redemption. And I feel that anything before detracts to the power of that moment. But it's a matter of taste, really.
I think I agree with you in one respect, that I think that the use of the music in the longer version is a little bit heavy-handed and overly ominous. I mean, it just shows the guy walking down a street and the music is just super ominous. But it's like, it's too early. It's we've got a phone. Hold on. Kieslowski was very clear in his comments about this film that the statement he was making is that killing is always unacceptable, no matter what the reason, that it's always wrong. As Catholics, we maybe oppose the death penalty in practice, but we don't believe that the death penalty and murder are equivalent. We don't believe that they're morally the same thing. Yet we do believe in this, in the value of human life in both cases. So it's kind of interesting. I'm trying to decide if this film is really drawing an equivalence between the two, or more just making a statement about the value of life. I mean, I can well believe that the death penalty accomplished nothing in the particular instance shown in the film, but I don't know that I buy into it as an argument in general, that kind of like taking life is always wrong no matter the reason, which is what Kieslowski said was in his intent in the film. But does the film give us any other options? Does the film give us any nuance to kind of escape that kind of straitjacketed conclusion?
Well, that's an interesting question, and that's the type of debate that Catholics should have. On the one hand, you have dead man walking, right? If you kill someone, you're not giving the possibility of redemption, and that's in the nuts and bolts of the New York Times article. But on the other one, Decalogue 5 cannot be seen just as a standalone piece. It has to be seen in the context of the time and the place, which is the history of Poland, the politics of the Communist Party, the handling of you look at Vaida, and he has the same thing about the value of human life. So they're not really the death penalty is a stepping stone to the conversation about the general topic. What is the value of human life? So I see the film, in quotes, like the coronavirus with all the tentacles communicating with all other 9, because it's about the vulnerability of children, it's about the importance of life, and this vulnerability of life is the subject of, in many ways, all of the Decalogue.
Yeah.
So,
and children are central to all or most of them, it seems.
Exactly right. Can you steal the affections of a child? Can you steal the life of a child? Can you deprive the child of a family? Can you send a child to a certain death? How do you deal with that? So, who are you to say the child, if a child is or not to be born? So it's always in the Decalogue, people that find themselves in the place of playing God. So I don't think it's a conversation about the death penalty. It's in a conversation about who are we to play God. So I'm not disturbed by the conversation, because we can have a variety of views, right? But I don't think
felt similarly watching this film. Yeah, I felt very much the same way. In fact, more so watching a short film about killing than watching Dekalog 5. I think that Dekalog 5, there's something about the way that it's presented that feels more straitjacketed, as you would say, Thomas. But with short film about killing, well, maybe it's even just in the title that it identifies this is about killing, the act of killing, less so the death penalty. But also in the way that it's cut, even within the first 2 minutes, we're jumping among these 3 characters much more so than happens in the Dekalog 5 cut, where it's a little more punctuated. There's time spent with the taxi driver, and then cut time spent with Jacek, or time spent with the lawyer. I think in the short film about killing, their destinies are so much more bound up in one another, not just in the way the scenes are cut together, but also obviously in the sort of mysticism of it, the premonitions or the sense that the young lawyer has, or the palm reading, the providential moment of their encounter in the cafe. And then, of course, too, with the ending in Dekalog 5 seeming to be much more explicit. I abhor it. Well, what is it? I guess that's a question one could ask, but a much quieter ending to a short film about killing, without any words being spoken. I thought that, asking myself this question, why this film, why Dekalog 5 to also craft into a larger experience? And it seems to me that there was something essential going on in this Decalogue. Not that there isn't in all of these stories, but that somehow this story about taking life essentializes so many of the themes that we detect in the other stories. At least so far, we've only gotten through half of them on this podcast. But like you say, this act of playing God, there's maybe something sort of climactic, that impulse to play God reaching a certain zenith in the choice to take a human life. This is also, I think, where the the Dekalog Five perhaps succeeds more than the short film about killing, because I think in a short film about killing, we're not only given reason to sympathize with Jacek early on, but we're also given a possible reason, a possible explanation for why he commits this murder. Because he later goes to Beata and asks her if she wants to go with him in this car out to the mountains. That scene isn't in Dekalog 5, and so the senselessness of this killing is what we're left with. We're not really given anything to indicate why he does this, which seems to point even more so to its sort of absolute wresting of divine power in this individual.
Yeah.
Something
but we also
really diabolic.
do see, but in both films, we do see him doing a lot of pointlessly cruel things, or at least observing them in some cases. But the most importantly, when he pushes the rock onto the overpass,
right,
and hits a car. So yeah, but it's that last scene is one of the biggest changes to the between the two films.
Right.
The scene where he visits Beata. I think it's clear that he doesn't know that she knows the taxi driver.
No, that he doesn't think she's going to suspect.
Yeah. It's clear that he's not killing him because he was involved with her or something like that. It's just he kills him because he wants a car and some money.
Maybe. But like that scene on the overpass with the rock, there's something so essential about this choice. And because it's removed from particular motives or relationships, because it's so seemingly senseless, it's all the more profound, and I keep using this word, essential, for it. And I think that it actually offers a way to look at the rest of the films in total.
I agree with you, because it's a point of entry, and ultimately this is the Decalogue is indirectly a conversation with the history of Poland in the 20th century, and the reference, however indirect, is Auschwitz, right? Is the sort of the canonization of, in quotes, the right to kill because you're different, because you're this or the other, and there's this avalanche of an ideology that dehumanized. So I think that's the reference for the Decalogue. So one can say, and so repeat with others, it's not political, or what Kieslowski, who was, an ironist and everything, it's not political. The heck it is political. Is enormously engaged with the history of 20th century Poland. It seems to me, right?
I really like that he doesn't make the taxi driver sympathetic, with the exception of him feeding the dog. Even that is like, there's something creepy about.
Well, because
like, the way...
he feeds him with a sandwich that his wife made for him, right? So
right.
My wife made this, and he throws it to the dog. There's something so callous about that.
And when he's watching the dog, he's like licking his lips as he watches the dog eat the sandwich. It's this weird thing.
In fact, when he's killed by Jacek, it's almost as if Jacek arrives as this sort of avenging angel to take vengeance upon him for all of his cruelty,
his petty crimes.
Yeah,
and it reminds me so much of the night porter in the documentary, because so many of the things he does are so utterly petty. He's just deciding so specifically about who he does and doesn't want in his car. We see the couple from Dekalog 2 trying to get a ride with him, and he just delights in leaving them in the lurch. There's so many petty acts. I have to admit, I find the poodle thing funny when he startles the poodles by honking the horn. It's a mean thing to do, but it's still hilarious. He's such an unlikable character, and I can absolutely imagine him as a concentration camp guard, in Auschwitz or something like that. It's very,
and yet still, his murder is, unbearable.
Now, in the long version, it's supposedly the longest murder in film history, at least up to that point. I don't know if since then, but it's
yeah. Well,
quite
it's
long.
difficult to watch in Dekalog 5, and even more so in a short film about killing. Not just because it's extended, but because in Dekalog 5. The camera mercifully cuts away as Jacek brings the rock down.
Yeah, yeah.
But in a short film about killing, it does not. And it very much does not.
Yeah.
It stays with him. And it's a devastating shot. I've seldom felt so devastated by something in a film. And I think you Maria Elena, you spoke to this at the beginning of this episode about the aesthetics of this film and the brutality, the theater of cruelty. This is truly remarkable, and one of the ways I think that these films both succeed most is in capturing this intensity of this moment of taking life in both cases. One in a very clinical, deliberate and planned sort of way. The other earlier, very messy, very chaotic. And in fact, it's the chaotic, it's the attention to detail in both instances that's so troubling. So when Jacek begins to strangle the taxi driver, and we get the shot of his feet running into the pedals and one shoe and sock coming off, for me there was something about
the ropes in his mouth, and he's like has to get it out of his mouth onto his neck.
Right. It's these little sort of odd details that go together to not only convey a certain realism, but also a certain desperation and violence and grotesqueness.
And we haven't even talked about
Go on.
the face of the taxi driver, where we get to see him with blood coming down and everything. It's a Christ figure. It's a Christ.
Wow.
In the Golgotha, wouldn't you say? There's something reminiscent. So and this one specifically, Dekalog 5, makes a mess of you, of your thoughts and of your heart, right? Because that confession of the drifter explaining Jacek what had happened throws a different light. What could have been if? Right, so the viewers of the listeners of the podcast should view Blind Chance. Great film. What happens if you take a train or don't take a train? You become a Solidarity member, you become a member of the Communist Party, or you become a middle of the road person. And that is Kieslowski, this uncertainty, this moving around, not figuring out exactly your place.
When they're in the jail talking, and he tells about his younger sister having been run over by his friend in a tractor when they were drinking vodka and killed, and him leaving home because of that. Do you take that as, because you mentioned the viewer having a change of heart in that moment, do you take it as we are supposed to sympathize and think, well, it's not his fault, he did this because of this tragic situation, or more that is just a view of another possibility for this character, showing that even if he is a monster, even if he is despicable, it's possible that he could have been something else, and the fact that he's still alive and talking about it shows that there's still possibility for him to change. Because I don't come away thinking, oh, well, he's just a victim of his circumstance.
No, exactly right. Because
this
is not a Hollywood film, right? This is not a Hollywood film. For starters, in the narrative, where you, instead of having 3 acts, you have the elision of act number 2, which is the discovery of the criminal and the trial and all that. You just have act 1 and act 3. And it's not designed to give you an exculpation at all. It is the old Jean Renoir approach. The heart has its reasons. This is the messiness. So it's an acceptance of how things are, not an exculpation via an explanation.
Yeah.
So anything going to psychologize the characters, you end up with a classic Hollywood style narrative, which can be done anywhere in the classic era, studio system, or can be done today. The explanation of why people function the way they are, and you end up, being woke, so to speak. But here it is all the objective horrors, and then it's a glimpse of an explanation that's an understanding, but it falls short of it. So a change of heart, and I have the students, is because some of them are learning to write characters and all that. It's subtle how it gets done.
I see.
It doesn't want you to shift alliances.
Right.
That's
I gotcha.
the master.
Yeah.
The mastery in writing.
Yeah, I think that I'm so primed all the time, especially, just being alive at this time, to be bombarded with political messaging or propaganda or agendas, and so it's difficult for me to let go of that, or not to bring that with me into my experience of a film. And so I have to confess, I watched Dekalog 5 first, and then I watched a short film about killing. Watching Dekalog 5, I was totally like, Kieslowski, what have you done? You've been so nuanced and subtle and complex and light of hand in these other instances, but with Dekalog 5, it's just writ large, down with the death penalty. And I walked away from my experience of a short film about killing with a much more to think about, which I'm glad, because this has been my experience with these Dekalog films, is that on the first one, I'm often confounded in some way, for the first viewing, that is. And then on the second viewing, I'm able to reach deeper into what the film is actually doing. And I think that it was on that second viewing my viewing of a short film about killing, I'll be interested now to go back and actually watch Dekalog 5 a second time. But watching a short film about killing, I much more appreciated what the film does.
Yeah, I came into this with a certain amount of resistance as well, having having seen Dekalog 5 once before, and then having read Kieslowski's kind of statement about his beliefs about killing in general. I'm not particularly pro death penalty, but a pet peeve of mine in Catholic moral theology is you hear a lot of people now speak as though opposition to the death penalty should be based on almost an equivocation between all types of killing being the same, and that if you execute a murderer, that makes you the same as a murderer, or that they're both equally affronts to the dignity of human life. And I just totally reject that argument. Not because I'm particularly pro death penalty, in practice. So yeah, I think this is helpful to discuss it in this way because, especially as you say in the context of Polish life at the time, because
it's unavoidable.
I was all too primed. Yeah, I was all too primed to see this as a very didactic, heavy-handed piece that I didn't agree with the message of. But when you say we're not meant to change our allegiances, I think that's a very important point there.
That's exactly what I think the purpose is. And also what happens is that and this is especially when you prepare a class and we had to write about a film, one thing is the work itself and how it is put together, how you receive it. And something else is the layer of commentary on the work, beginning with the filmmaker, right? You hear all these interviews, read about them in this and that, and it's like, okay, well, I am this, I am a pessimist, and then people, it's a Rorschach's test. If you remove the commentary and you see the work, I think you can objectively say that the film is about killing, regardless of the horrific circumstances in each case. and it connects to the value of life that you have in Decalogue 8, the little Jewish girl whom the later on philosophy professor thinks she has died because of a lie, which was done for, in quotes, a greater good. So it's all these dilemmas that surround the act of killing or the act of being responsible for someone else's death. So it's not about a particular circumstance or a legal approach. I don't see this film as didactic. And the putting it on the same level, for me, it's the superior conversation, above conversation, which is the value of life, which is what the whole Decalogue is, the value of life, and how we may find ourselves in places where we don't value it, we trample it. So didactic is not an adjective I use with Decalogue 5, in my experience, right? And the reason why I want to point to the so-called confession scene, how it is staged behind bars inside the cell to the students, is for them to understand subtlety in the mise-en-scène and also in the conversation on the dialogue of the characters, right? So the wealth. You may have noticed, and when you see the film, at least Decalogue twice, is at the end of the trial, we see the lawyer who's heartbroken. He hasn't been able to be effective. He says hello to the family, and behind we see a woman being taken away in a wheelchair. There's no explanation about who that woman is, but you get to understand in that courtroom that was empty except for the family of Jacek and a woman in a wheelchair, you've got to figure out that it's the wife of the taxi driver in a wheelchair. So you end up getting another back layer of information about even like a marriage. That taxi driver must be fed up with having to take care of a bedridden woman, right?
Yeah.
So Kieslowski, he's stunning because the first time I watched the thing and I was too taken, but the second time I saw it, I said, well, this is bound to have been the wife, which is mentioned, of course, in the act of killing. Wife, he says, and you feel well, of course. And then you have her connected to the sandwich, which is sort of this dark humor. But then it's this eye for detail, and detachment that he has. That's so stunning. Because a pet peeve that I always have with some, current films, American films, this and that, sometimes, is that there is no world attached to the characters. That you see the action, what happens, but you don't get to a sense of world. It's very seldom that you get to see that. There's a phenomenal little jewel called Hell or High Water, which explains Trump's America. Phenomenal film. And there you have a world. What does it mean to live in East Texas or West Texas in the countryside? What's those main streets, the stores? What do people do, right? That's why a film like Hillbilly Elegy, the film, is a crime against everything that you can think of, because it's the sensationalizing of hillbilly life, right? It's the removal of everything that makes the book interesting. It's outside because it's made by, in quote, a coastal elite mindset. But when you look at Hell or High Water, you get to see, and there's another film that has you shift your heart from the beginning to the end, right? It's a phenomenal film. Another one, Manchester by the Sea, that depicts a certain environment, right?
Yeah, that's the only one of those three films you mentioned that I've actually seen. But similarly devastating. Yeah, very Catholic. Similarly devastating, but in a different sense. Also having to do with death, but Well, I'm really glad that we spoke with you about this film. I don't think that Thomas and I would have been able to make our way through this conversation and with quite the same level of fruit born. But we've been going a while here. Before we finish, were there any other questions that we had? I don't know. Did we answer the question? I guess Kieslowski knew from the outset that he wanted to do this in two versions, the Decalogue and short film about killing. And do we know why?
Well, first off, it's an economic proposition, right? When you look at the, I don't know the production story that well, but when you look at the credits of Dekalog 5, you get to see the filmmaking unit tour, which was the one Kieslowski and Zanussi were part of. You get to see TV Polska, Polish television, and you get to see Sender Freies Berlin, which means that there was German production money. And when you look at a short film about killing, you see MK2, Maren Karmitz, important, I think Polish origin, Jewish, German, French producer, and you get to see Janus Film, the distributors, right? So you get to see that it must have been, I'm sure this is the case, that they thought a series made for $100,000, Polish television, that will go, nowhere in these tumultuous times. The films were shown on Polish television around the time of the election and the demise of the communist regime. They must not have thought that they have what they ended up having, which was a money pot, right? In one of these reviews of the film later on, it is said that if the series was made for 100,000 American dollars, so to speak, they reaped the box office and the sales for the film were $3 million, right?
Wow.
It was a money pot, so to speak. Right. So
I believe, I remember reading about this. I think that the film length versions were somehow part of the deal to get financing for the whole thing. I can't remember the exact details, but
it makes sense. It's a proposition that you have something for television that you bet may have a longer life, in this case, a theatrical release, right?
Right.
And one thing that I was thinking when I was watching the series is, if you were to do a similar series today, your backers, producers, would be Netflix, HBO, Showtime. What kind of series would you have addressing contemporary issues with, in quotes, a crime slant? And you would get the Jinx, I'll See You in the Dark, all these, or the one about the Macmillions. You would have all these sensationalizing of a topic that is supposed to be of interest to vast audiences. The seriousness of the Decalogue, I cannot imagine being done today.
No, and I can't imagine it either. I think that this is something that you have to earn, and that you have to earn through suffering. I think that my experience of Polish art, especially of the last century, is so much like my experience of the Decalogue. I remember going to Jasna Gora, where Our Lady of Czestochowa is, and there's an incredible Stations of the Cross there. I forget the name of the painter, but these stations are brutal, but in a way that's very I don't know. It's very particular, and it's similar to the way that Dekalog 5 and a short film about killing are brutal. There's a spiritual seriousness. There's a awareness of the gravity of suffering, of death, of the act of killing, and I think that that's something that's just so far away from us culturally right now in the United States.
Right.
Perhaps maybe not always, but certainly right now. And so
the weight of history is different. You cannot produce a Gorecki here with a symphony of sorrowful I forget the exact title,
Songs.
songs, right?
Yeah.
Which is basically Auschwitz, the destruction
Yeah.
of life. And if you take the films of Pavel Palikovsky, the wonderful filmmaker of Aida and Cold War, he's a descendant of Kieslowski, a spiritual descendant of Kieslowski, because they are dealing with Polish history, and you take someone like Chinatown, the director.
Oh no. Yeah.
Polanski.
Yeah.
Polanski. Polanski has never overcome the horror of a life shaped until his mid-20s in Poland.
Right.
Never. How can you?
There's another element to this too, which is a little discomforting. Kieslowski said he found it easier to make films under the communist Polish system than afterwards. You didn't have to worry about whether something was going to be profitable or not, and it may not be. We may not like to say this because obviously, the assumption is that film art, controlled by the communist state is always going to be compromised in some way. But, these filmmakers in Poland specifically, especially in Poland specifically, found ways to get around the censors, with a certain amount of ease ultimately. And, of course, it was also made at a particular period in, communist Poland, where this was possible towards the end of communist Poland. But yeah, he just didn't have to worry about whether something was going to be profitable or not. And, as much as, to equivocate between communist tyranny and, the tyranny of the market is kind of misleading in a certain way. There is a certain amount of truth to the fact that, in a system that's determined entirely by, consumer demand or whatever, there is a sort of that is deciding what films are made or what films are not made. But we're always free to choose based on other criteria. Production companies are free to do that to a certain extent. But I mean, it is true. They were able to simply make films that they thought were important to make to some extent, regardless of commercial interest. Of course, it was a commercial success, as you said, but yeah.
Two observations. One is that in order, again, to see the mindset, understand the mindset at the time, there's the great book of Czesław Miłosz, The Captive Mind. Phenomenal book that describes the 3 or 4, 5 mindsets of Polish intellectuals that say yes to the communist regime. An eye-opener. And two, a phrase I always cite from André Malraux, the writer and Minister of Culture of Charles de Gaulle. The phrase is, film is a business that sometimes disguises itself as art, right? And you have the understanding of Lenin of what film is for, which is a propaganda tool. And then you have the two clashing systems. What I was like always to let the students know is that whether you are in Europe or whether you are in the US, it's not the same, doesn't work the same way, but there are public funds. That there's the National Endowment for the Humanity, for the Arts, there are state funds, this and that there's a possibility of having documentaries. The ones, the documentaries that you see on PBS here are not the ones that you see on HBO. HBO, for the reasons that we have been talking of the market, goes into the exploitation, this and that, and then you have all these series, crime, and then occasionally interesting work as well. But the PBS production is very different. And it's basically monies assigned, allotted, given to filmmakers, right? You have this great series, POV, Frontline, American Masters, American Experience, that handle the life, culture, politics of the US and the world in ways that you do not see done privately, right? So I am not so despondent, and understanding, the history of how all these things get made, you see that yes, there is something to be said for those smart, intelligent, tenacious filmmakers and their difficulties of constraint that produce work. And a case study of interest is Yang Yimou in the People's Republic of China, whose first film, first decade, was phenomenal indictments, even the Red Guards, everything we can think of. But beginning with a film of 2006, I believe, Hero, he adheres to the Communist Party line. So there's so much that you can produce in a limited space, right? Here we have the space is much bigger for great work, right? In totalitarian regimes, you have the boot on you all the time, and not everybody is clever to speak metaphorically, allegorically, right? So that's why I don't see those so opposing. It's the conditions of production, right? And
well, I think one of the great things one of the great things about talking to you about this is to get a greater sense of the differences between these different film cultures and these starting off with at the beginning of our conversation with the different cultural differences between you and your husband, for example. It's very valuable to zoom out and see this in the context of Polish film, something that neither James or I know a great deal about. So it's really helpful to see the big picture of the series in its cultural and political context, and we're appreciative of that.
What helps me in my particular case is that I have been attending the Berlin Film Festival since 1985. So I got to see all of the films that came out from then, the Eastern Europe, and I got to see all those allegories, the fights and this and that. And I also got to see after 89, 1991, the things that have been coming out, and we still have great filmmakers engaged in a conversation about the recent past, of the 20th century past, beginning with Sokurov, who's still making films, and some other recent filmmakers that are phenomenal. So we get to talk about one set of films, but they are not alone, right? We may not have the chance to see the rest of the production, but if you have the chance of the film festivals, that's where you get a wider sense of what is being produced, right? So the complexity and the variety of international cinema, I guess my point is.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to take this show on the road and go to the festivals.
I hate to say it, but we don't know what film we're doing next.
I know.
Because we haven't scheduled it yet.
At the end of the episodes, we usually let our listeners know what the next film is going to be.
I'm going to say it's going to be probably either Bicycle Thief or Ben-Hur. It's going to be one of those two, I'm pretty sure.
Maria Elena, thank you so much for joining us on Criteria. You really helped open up these films for me, as I'm sure for the listeners and probably for your students too, year after year. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Maybe we can have you on to talk about Strange Cargo or something later on.
Borsig is a great filmmaker.
Yeah.
It's one awaiting further discoveries.